some of the concepts that we talked about before, but I'm doing a little bit more today. So we will do a little bit of background. I will try to zip through this part because this should be stuff that you already know. And then focus most of the time on actually gas exchange on ECMO. So we'll talk about how to measure it, what the determinants are, what we monitor, and then ways to improve oxygen, or ways to manipulate oxygen delivery on VA ECMO, and then talk a little bit about mixed venous stats, ways to manipulate oxygenation on VV ECMO, and then spend a very short time on carbon dioxide exchange because it's sort of easy peasy. All right, so background. This is where you just have to remember all your equations. So just to remember that oxygen content is your oxyhemoglobin plus your dissolved oxygen. Right, so your PaO2 is a relatively small component, and your hemoglobin is really important. And then that your oxygen delivery is your total quantity of oxygen available for tissue consumption at a given time. So that's going to include your arterial oxygen content that we just talked about, multiplied by the quantity of blood presented to the tissue. So your cardiac output times your oxygen content. And then we'll talk about, so outside of ECMO, what are your components of oxygen delivery? So your cardiac output is determined by your heart rate and your stroke volume. And then your stroke volume is going to be affected by your preload, your afterload, and your contractility. And your oxygen content is going to depend on your hemoglobin, your saturation, and a little bit on your PaO2. So what about when we're on VA ECMO, for example? So here now, your cardiac output is your native cardiac output plus your ECMO flow, right? And your oxygen content is your native oxygen content plus your ECMO oxygen content. So that's going to be important as we move forward, and we'll talk about how that's a little different on BP later. So that's oxygen delivery, and then in terms of oxygen consumption, the amount of oxygen consumed across the lung, which is identical to the amount of oxygen consumed in your systemic metabolism. So the oxygen available is your cardiac output times your arterial content, and the oxygen returned is your cardiac output times your venous content. And then your oxygen extraction ratio. So normally tissues extract 25% of your arterial oxygen content. And this is going to be important when we talk about why it's convenient that we can measure mixed venous sat. So your oxygen extraction ratio is your arterial content minus your venous content over your arterial content. And generally, if your extraction ratio is greater than 25%, you either have inadequate arterial content or inadequate cardiac content. So this is where SVO2 becomes really important, and at least for us who can't, float swans, it's this is really the only situation where we actually can measure a mixed venous sat. So your oxygen consumption mathematically is your cardiac output, right, times 1.34 times your hemoglobin times your arterial sat minus your venous sat. Normally your oxygen delivery is about 4 to 5 times the amount of oxygen consumption, and the ratio of oxygen delivery over oxygen consumption measures your venous saturation. So your SVO2 is really an important index to follow when managing patients on ECMO. And normally we shoot, I think Laura mentioned, normal will be around 75%. So usually you'll see us worry if our SVO2 is below 70. Sometimes. But at least we want to know. And then I'll actually email this. I love this paper. This is like a very short, it's from 1990. Do you have this one? I give this to all my fellows when I was in Michigan on their first day. Because somebody gave it to me on my first day. But it really talks about this whole concept that mixed venous saturation is what we would really like to know in all of our patients. Because we really want to know. We don't care as much about all the things that we measure are really not as important. Are we actually delivering enough oxygen to the tissues? All right, so now we're going to move into our two modes. I'm going to talk more about this tomorrow, but VA and VD. I'm not going to go through this because we're going to go through this in more detail tomorrow. And this is just a little sketch that I'm going to come back to later on. And then the BV is where we're using a double lumen cannula in the right atrium. Alright, so now we're gonna talk about how we measure gas exchange on ECMO. So there's a couple things. So we talked about where we get our blood gases. So we measure our circuit venous gas, so our pre-oxygenator gas, our post-oxygenator gas, and then our, well, what we call our baby gas. If you don't have a baby, your patient gas. And these are all important for different reasons. So every 6 hours, you're gonna have what we call triple gases, or essentially a patient gas, a pre, and a post-oxygenator gas. And they're all gonna tell you different things. And then we also talked about all the different saturations we measure. So we have the patient's arterial saturation and our mixed venous saturation. Those are the two that we really pay attention to. And then the post-oxygenator saturation we talked about. And this is essentially a diagram of what she just showed you. So where all the different ports are, where we measure our pre and post oxygenator gases, and where we measure our mixed venous sat. Any questions about that part, about where we measure? I think that was more clear when you're actually at the circuit. And one of the things that we'll do every day, so we'll do tomorrow and again the next day, is we'll have you walk the circuit, so you actually have to put your hand on and trace where you measure all the different saturations and where you draw your gases. Will become much clearer. So what about how do we manipulate gas exchange on ECMO? So it's important to remember, particularly for respiratory ECMO, is that gas exchange is occurring both at the oxygenator and in the lungs. But particularly for our neonatal respiratory cases, but also for the pediatric respiratory cases, for the majority of the run, most of the gas exchange is actually happening in the oxygenator. And there's not much gas exchange happening in the lungs. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is there's a reason that they went on, and usually it's because the lungs aren't working well. Two is that we actually wean the ventilator to try to minimize barotrauma, so we're trying not to use the lungs as much. Three is that one of the things that we talked about before is there's a big cytokine response to going on, and so you actually have a deterioration in your lung function the first couple of days. And then last is you have decreased pulmonary blood flow. Bypass. And so just as a picture, so this is a typical series of x-rays. So you have, so this is where you go, this is a baby with a left CDH, so this is where you go on. So when this is your very first x-ray, right when you go on, you still have some aeration. This is 36 hours in, so you have some, what we call whiteout. And then this is without manipulating anything, often in terms of ventilator settings. As your inflammatory response gets better, and the other thing you notice is as your body wall edema gets better, you'll see your lungs reopen. And so here, during this part here, your membrane is doing most of your work. Your lungs are not really contributing much. And one of the things that we look for, we'll talk about when we're trying to decide when to take the patient off, is we should start to see that their lungs are contributing more and we're needing to provide less support from the membrane. So we've talked about this. I think Laura showed the exact same picture. But we have our sweep gas and then our flow going through our fiber oxygen. And I think you also had this exact same slide. But essentially, one important thing is the oxygenator is really efficient for CO2 removal, much more efficient than for oxygenation. That's part of the reason that we spend very little time thinking about or talking about CO2 removal, because it's usually not an issue. And in fact, one of the things that Laura mentioned before, in the neonates, it's actually sometimes only an issue in that it's too efficient. And one of the things that now, most of the time we can get away with just going down to 0.1 liter, but we used to actually bleed in CO2 and or use something called carbogen that was 95% oxygen and 5% carbon dioxide, so that you can keep your CO2s in a normal range and not overventilate.
We don't do that anymore?
We generally don't need to. I've had one or two times where I've thought about it, but generally it's not necessary. Have you ever, Laura, had to use it? Yeah, no, I haven't had to do it here. But it was commonplace. But we also used to not wean the sweep flows so low. now that we can go down to 0.1 liters, most of the time you can maintain normal CO2s. All right, and then we talked about the blood and ventilating gas are flowing in opposite direction. And that blood closer to the membrane is gonna saturate earlier than central fast moving blood. All right. And this is just essentially showing you that CO2 diffusion is much more efficient than oxygen. So what are the things, I'm gonna show you some examples. What are the things that contribute to oxygen exchange? So the biggest one, and the reason it's in yellow, is that it's really dependent on the blood flow rate. So the primary way that we manipulate oxygen delivery on ECMO is to manipulate the blood flow rate. But it also depends on the blood path thickness, on the membrane diffusion character, on the membrane surface area, but the biggest thing is oxygen delivery is independent of the gas flow rate. So if you remember nothing else, and I think I'm gonna say it like 15 times, oxygen exchange dependent on blood flow, gas exchange dependent on sweet flow. Or CO2 exchange dependent on sweet flow.
The reason why she's saying it 100 times and I said it 100 times is because no matter how many times we say it to you in here, when you're at the bedside, you're going to dial up the FiO2 on the circuit.
Yeah.
So we feel like
And
if
I'm
we
gonna
say
show
it
you.
1,000 times,
Yeah.
maybe one of you will turn up the blood flow.
Yeah, and I'm gonna show you how that really doesn't help you that much. And then CO2 exchange, the opposite. So dependent on gas diffusion pressure gradient, most dependent on the gas flow rate and independent of the blood flow rate. And we'll repeat it again. And I'm gonna skip this because Laura already covered this. This is just the concept of rated flow.
We just said what it was. We didn't really
Okay.
talk about it per se.
All right, I'll talk about that. So it's essentially the flow at which an artificial lung is capable of raising the oxygen saturation in venous blood with a crit of 40 from 75 to an arterial side of 95. So turning up the pump past the rated flow isn't going to improve your oxygen delivery. Does that make sense? All right. So one more time. The PaO2 is dependent on ECMO flow and the CO2 is dependent on sweet gas flow. So increasing your flow is going to increase your PaO2. Increasing your gas flow rate will decrease your CO2. And then I think we mentioned for our PD quadrox, which is what we primarily use for the kids less than 15 kilos. Did you say 2.5? I had 2.8.
2.8 we said.
Yeah.
2.8. Oh, it's
Yeah,
for
it's
flow?
earlier,
Yeah, yeah. All right.
But I
Just
can
wanna make sure I
remember
have the same.
2.5 better than I remember 2.8, so that's why I remember.
Yeah, I think I heard you say 2.
Yeah, I was on 2.8.
But when I was saying to Kim, isn't it 2.5? She said it was 5. That's how I remember it, is because it doesn't matter to me whether it's 2.8 or 5. And then we talked a little bit about about what problems can happen with the oxygenator. So you can have, we really don't feel much, but you can certainly have pulmonary edema or hemorrhage. More commonly, we have thrombus in our oxygenator. That's far and away the most common reason that we change oxygenators. And it is interesting that since we were muttering over there, but since we got rid of the bladder, it seems that we changed more oxygenators than we did when we used to just change bladders. And then we can also have heat flow mismatch. All right, so this is where we're going to talk about how, and I'm going to show you some examples about how the different things that you can do will improve your oxygen delivery and why changes in flow and also changes in hemoglobin make a much bigger difference than changes in FiO2. So the amount of oxygen transferred across the oxygenator is going to depend on your FiO2 to the oxygenator sweet gas in a small way, your hemoglobin in a fairly sizable way, and then the saturation of blood entering the oxygenator. And oxygen delivery to the patient is going to depend on all of the above plus the flow. So if we look at, for example, for this example, this is a 2.5 kilo baby who's flowing at 200 milliliters per minute, and her sweep is that your FiO2 is 25% and your hemoglobin is 10. So you have going into the oxygenator, so your pre-oxygenator sat is 60% and your PO2 is 34. And post-oxygenator, your sat's 100 and your PO2 is 100. So if we want to figure out what the oxygen content in the blood going in and out, we can use our fancy calculations that we did before. So remember, it's the amount of the hemoglobin plus the dissolved. So if we do the calculations, we have 8.3 milliliters per deciliter pre and 13.9 milliliters per deciliter post. You don't need to do the calculations. And you'll see why this is important. So your oxygen transfer is 5.6 milliliters per deciliter across the oxygenator. And your oxygen delivery is 2 deciliters per minute times 5.6 milliliters per deciliter. So your oxygen delivery is about 4.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. This says you don't need to worry so much about the calculations, but it will be important when you see how you manipulate different things and how that affects. So normal resting rates of oxygen consumption in a newborn, for example, is 5 to 8 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So this is perhaps not that great, right? So what are the things that we can do to change the situation? So we talked about, so one thing we can do is increase the oxygen content of blood flowing out of the oxygenator. So we can either increase the PaO2 or we can increase the hemoglobin. 2 is we can decrease the oxygen content of blood flowing into the oxygenator. Or 3, we can increase the blood flow rate through the oxygenator. And I'll show you how each of these are different. So let's say, and this is what Laura was saying, why it doesn't make necessarily such a huge difference to change your FiO2. So let's say you decide, instead of adjusting your flow, that you're gonna increase your FiO2 on your sweep and leave everything else the same. So essentially you've gone from 8.3 to 15.1 now. And you've increased your oxygen delivery a little bit, but not that much, right? You've gone from 4.5 to 5.4. So not a huge difference. So it's gonna do a couple, and then if you notice, the PaO2 in your post-oxygenator gas was 500. So what you've done is you've markedly increased your PaO2 in your blood exiting the oxygenator. You've marginally increased your oxygen content, and you've marginally increased the amount of oxygen transferred across the oxygenator into the patient's blood. So you've made some difference, but not a huge difference. So what else can you do?
Increase flow rate.
Yeah, you can increase the flow. What else can you do? If you forgot and you didn't remember that what you want to do is increase the blood. Yeah, you could change the hemoglobin. Skip that for right now. All right, so what happens if we change the hemoglobin? So, Laura's gonna shut her ears, but we're gonna pretend that we transfuse the hemoglobin.
I don't say don't do it.
No, I know. And I'll talk about the pluses and minuses. So here, so changing the hemoglobin actually can make a pretty big difference. So if you look at the top example where your hemoglobin is 10 and you increase your hemoglobin to 15, now you've changed your oxygen delivery from 4.5 to 6.6. So you've made a bigger difference. It does come at a cost though, because if you run your hemoglobin higher, you increase the viscosity and therefore might increase your risk of hemolysis. So it's not that that's always the answer, but it is something to think about. That's part of the reason that we tend to sometimes run our hemoglobins a little bit higher, although we're adjusting.
I think it depends on whether you believe that patients can do better on lower hematocrits and how we approach it, I think, because where I came from, we ran low hematocrits, and so I am a believer that you can oxygenate patients on lower crits. So actually where I was before, we ran on hemoglobins, which would have given us a crit in the high 20s. And even in single ventricles, when you're on ECMO, the way that the blood flow goes through their heart, which we'll talk about, allows them to have full saturation. And so I knew that I had good oxygen delivery with that. So when I came here, we went to running crits of 30 to 35. So I start with that, but then I do the rest of the evaluation of, in this patient, yes, theoretically, a crit of 30 to 35 should work, and does it work? Whereas the NICU here and in other places has always tended to run higher hematocrits, so then you guys make sure that with their higher hematocrit that they're doing fine, and then when you see your plasma free hemoglobin is at 300,
Then we
then
back
you
off.
guys are like, well, maybe instead of greater than 40, we can be 35 to 40, but now you guys are starting to
The
start.
other thing is
with
in our smaller kids, you're also somewhat limited by, your flow may be limited by your venous return. So if you can't go up on the flow anymore, one way that you can improve your oxygen delivery is to change your hemoglobin. So I come from a place where we always kept the crits greater than 40 for VA and greater than 45 for VV. But we have adjusted, we're generally keeping it greater than 35, unless we're really having issues with oxygen delivery. But that's another thing you can modulate. And then the last one, right, is to think about increasing your flow. So here you increased your flow from 200 to 240, so not a huge increase in your flow, but you got it pretty sizable. So you got almost an increase of almost 10 in your milliliters, no, an increase of almost 1, sorry, in your milliliters per kilogram per minute of oxygen delivery by just going up on the flow a very small amount. So just to look at your effects, so when you increased your sweep from 25% to 100%, you did get a difference, so you went from 4.5 to 5.4, but you also now have a post-memory PO2 of 500. You increased your hemoglobin, you made a sizable difference, but a relatively small increase in your flow from 200 to 240 gave you the same bang for your buck as going up from 25% to 100% in your FiO2. So in general, if you have enough venous return to support it, the most effective way of, assuming you have a normal hemoglobin, is to increase your flow. All right, so now I'm going to talk for a few minutes about VV.
What are the,
Yeah.
in this mode, what are the downsides for having high FiO2s? Because I wouldn't expect you to have the same type of oxygen toxicity to the lung.
Nothing.
All right. Yeah.
You got it written off as you have prematurity.
Yeah, but we don't have premature babies generally on ECMO, right? I don't know that there's huge downsides.
Nothing. I mean, nobody thinks about it in the same way. And so you just let your PO2 be high and your FiO2 be high.
No, but he's asking, what's the down, so going up on your FiO2 to 100%, if you get the same bang for your buck, what? The problem is you get that bang for your buck, but you don't get any more. So the
Right,
only
yeah.
other way you can manipulate, if
Yeah.
you need more than that, is to go up in your flow.
Right, that
Yeah.
makes
Makes
sense.
Some
sense,
places, so that's where I was saying that some places philosophically put them on 100 and sit on it, but then that requires that you're really paying attention to your PaO2 daily, and then it moves from 600 down to 200, and you start attending to it. For me, and maybe it's just because it was the way that I was raised, I feel like dialing up the FiO2 in order to keep the post-oxygen PaO2 greater than 250 is a nice safety mechanism, because when the ECMO specialists are dialing it to 90 and 100 and they can't dial it up any higher, they come and tell you, even if the PaO2 is 250 or 300, they say, I can't turn my dial any higher, so no one can forget that that's a part of the healthier circuit.
And it's interesting, the last two places I've been, we kept everyone at 100%. So really the only way you could improve your oxygen delivery was to change your hemoglobin or hemoglobin level. All right, so let's talk a little bit about VV. I know we haven't had our VV talk yet, but so now you have a 2.5-kilo baby who's on the same flow. You have your same FiO2 and your oxygen sweep and your same hemoglobin. And so this is VA, so now we're down here on VV. So what's the big difference with VV, right, is you're gonna have some recirculation. So your saturation going into the oxygenator is gonna be relatively higher, and so the amount of oxygen that you are actually able to deliver is gonna be less, right? So here, depending on how much recirculation you have, you may have a SAT going in of 90%, a PO2 of 55, and then a SAT coming out of 100, and a PO2 of 100, such that you're really only delivering about just a little over 1 milliliter per kilogram per minute, and this may not be adequate depending on what the baby's demands are. So here, if you look, so if you change, so this is where I'm used to running hemoglobins higher on VV, because that's one way that you can improve oxygen delivery without going without necessarily having to manipulate your flow. Because we'll talk about how manipulating your flow is, can be a double-edged sword on VB. So the ways we can compensate for higher saturation of blood entering the oxygenator and VB. So one is your FiO2 to your oxygenator, and so we do tend to use a higher FiO2 on our oxygenator. Two is to target a little bit of a higher crit. And so we've moved to 30 to 35, although I think most of us hover close to 35 for VA in the NICU, and closer to 30
You
in
guys
the other
have
side.
not moved to 30 to 35.
We've moved to 35.
35.
And 35 to 45 for VB. And then we tend to target a little bit higher flows, but we'll talk about it. You can actually have more recirculation at higher flows, so it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in terms of how to flow. And I'll show you a little bit of that. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about what we measure, and then I'll come back to recirculation and VB. So your arterial saturation, or your PO2, is determined by a combination. So you have your flow rate of blood through the oxygenator, your oxygen content in your post-oxygenator blood, your flow rate back through the lungs, and then your oxygen content in the blood coming back from the lungs. So your patient's arterial saturation is going to, and PO2 are going to increase under the following circumstances. So they're going to increase if you increase the flow, which we talked about. They're going to increase if you increase the oxygen content. So if you increase your FiO2. They're going to increase if you decrease the flow rate of blood through the lungs. So if you're not sending much blood to the lungs and just using your membrane lung, they're going to increase. And then lastly, it's going to increase if you increase oxygen content of blood coming back from the lungs. So if you have a higher mixed venous set or improving lung function. So this is one of the things we look for, what I call a step up in your PaO2s. So as your lung function improves and your lungs are contributing more, in addition to your membrane lung, you should start to see higher PaO2s. So that's one of the things in addition to clearing of the X-ray that we look for. And then, but what about if your patient arterial PaO2 is really high? That's usually generally, so late in the run, that can be a good thing, right? Because that's telling you that the lungs are contributing. Early in the run, so if you think back to that initial X-ray where your lungs aren't contributing, if you have a really high PaO2, something else is wrong. And almost always, in the first 24 hours or so, it indicates myocardial stun or dysfunction. And this is something that Laura will talk more about in terms of cardiac ECMO. But essentially, this is a sign. If your PaO2 is really high, if your PaO2 and post-membrane PaO2 are very similar, then it makes you concerned that very little blood is being pumped by the heart. And if you actually do an echo, you'll see these quivering hearts. So there's electrical activity of a heart rate, but the heart is like barely quivering. And the only blood flowing out of the right atrium is the blood going into the venous cannula. The only blood flowing in the aorta is the blood coming out of the arterial cannula. And this is when your patient's PO2 is going to approach your post-oxygenator PO2. And generally you'll see, and the other thing that you'll see on your arterial waveform is a totally flat line. So you'll have very little pulsatility. And the thing that you'll see is as your pulsatility improves, so as your cardiac function starts to improve, you'll see your PO2 will decrease. So a high PO2 isn't necessarily a good thing. And this is where we look at both the PO2 and the mixed venous set and all of our other markers, so your lactate, your urine output.
Is this PaO2 from the patient or from
From the
surgeon?
patient.
Oh, okay,
Patient.
sorry.
If the patient PO2 is the same as your post-membrane PO2 and you're early in the course, you have a problem. If you're late in the course, maybe it's that the lungs are really, really getting better, but you're still not going to get close.
Mm-hmm.
These are PO2s. I mean, you'll see, so say your post-membrane PO2 is 250, your patient PO2 may be 220, 230, if you're in stun.
So you're saying that if the heart's done, you don't have much oxygen consumption by the heart, it's not going through the coronary sinuses back to through the lungs and back through and mixing with it, decrease it?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's not that you don't have much metabolic demand from the heart, it's that relatively speaking, so your patient's oxygenation is a combination of the proportion of blood coming from the ECMO circuit versus the proportion of blood coming from the patient's heart. And then the oxygenation of both of those two different sources. So that if the heart is not working, the ECMO circuit will take up more of the blood. So you have a higher proportion of blood with a PaO2 of 250, and then the heart's not putting very much through. And whether you go on for cardiac reasons or whether you go on for respiratory reasons, our patients never have PaO2s of 250 coming out of their pulmonary veins, right? And so then that's why she's saying that if your baby's PaO2 is 220, 230, and your post-oxygenator is 250, almost all of what you're seeing is from the oxygenator, from the ECMO circuit itself. Does that make sense? So it's a good sign to see your baby's PaO2 go down. And if you do have someone with cardiac dysfunction, pulsatility comes back long before actual functional ejection. So you'll see pulsatility and everybody gets all excited. And then I let you down there because I say, yeah, but the baby's PaO2 is 230, so I don't really care that there's pulsatility because they're not really moving any significant cardiac output.
That makes sense.
Do you also see lower flows in the, or I'm not sure if it's pressure or flows in the venous arm?
You can't tell.
You can't tell. Okay.
It's generally, at least in our respiratory cases, it's generally a transient phenomenon, so usually hours, not days. And the kids that we see it most on is our HIE babies. So the babies that have multi-organ dysfunction, including cardiac dysfunction, it is not uncommon for them to have some stun when they first go on. All right, so how about the opposite? So the patient's SATs and PO2 are going to decrease if either you decrease the flow rate of the blood through the oxygenator, you're decreasing your oxygen content, so if you're decreasing your FiO2 or the post-oxygenator blood, you're increasing your flow rate of blood through the lungs, or you're decreasing your oxygen content of blood coming back from the lungs. So you have a lower mixed venous saturation or you have worsening lung function. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about oxygen delivery to the patients on VA, and then we'll talk a little bit more about mixed venous sat and then oxygenation on VP. So we mentioned in the very beginning, you guys know this just from critical care, is that your PO2 correlates only weekly with your oxygen content, right? It's much more based on your saturation and your hemoglobin. And correlate with the oxygen delivery to your tissues. And this is where we talk about, we frequently see a higher PO2 when the combined cardiac output has actually fallen. So this is why we really like to focus on the mixed venous sat. So we have, obviously we can measure PO2, we can try to calculate oxygen content and oxygen delivery, but what we really want to know is what's the ratio of oxygen delivery versus oxygen consumption? Are we adequately meeting the patient's demands? And that's where we use the mixed venous saturation. So usually we talked about systemic oxygen delivery is about 4 to 5 times that needed by the tissue, so we shoot for a mixed venous sat somewhere between 75 and 80%. And decreased oxygen delivery or increased consumption will result in lower mixed venous sat. So when we see a fall in mixed venous sat, it can either be that we are, that the patient's consumption is increasing. And so one of the things, if say your mixed venous sat is falling and you're on as much flow as you can get away with in terms of how much venous return you have, which is often the case for our smaller babies. One of the things that you can do is think about how can I decrease the patient's demand. So sedation, for example, and even occasionally muscle relaxation. We try not to use that, but there are ways. So every time you think about your mixed venous sat, you're needing to think about not only how can I provide more support, but how can I also take into consideration the patient's demands. And then I think we already have this slide before.
Is that why you do hypothermia?
So it's interesting, you said, so we actually use hypothermia, so for our neonates, we only use hypothermia if they're already receiving hypothermia for hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, but
There was one trial in Europe, actually looking at, thinking about ECMO as essentially a reperfusion injury. And so if hypothermia helps with HIE, would hypothermia help with ECMO, where you actually know the timing of the reperfusion? But the trial actually didn't show any improvement, and they tried to, I don't remember if Lara was involved too, but tried to put together a multi-center trial in the US to look at the same question, but couldn't, just struggled with finding funding. And so in general, we don't cool just because they go on ECMO. Does that make sense? But if we're cooling them for HIE, then we'll keep them cool for the full 72 hours on ECMO. But it theoretically makes sense, right, to think about. And then we talked about where we see so this is our stat crit monitor, and then and then you can also see it on the big display that's got a piece of paper over it. So how do you troubleshoot? So if you have a low mixed venous saturation, you're really needing to think about what's my problem. So do I have a fall in oxygen delivery? And if there's a fall in oxygen delivery, is it from the circuit or is the problem from the patient? So do I have decreased flow? Do I have decreased hemoglobin? Do I have decreased saturation, or I should say PaO2, of blood leaving the oxygenator? And then from the patient, do you have decreased native cardiac output? So this is where your PaO2 can be really high, but if you're in stun and your mixed venous sat is low, you know you have decreased native cardiac output. You may need to increase your flow in order to improve your oxygen delivery. And then again, decreased hemoglobin or decreased saturation of PaO2 leaving the blood. You can also get in trouble with the PDA with the left to right shunt, but generally, typically not in our patients. And then what else? So we talked about decreased delivery. Then what things are contributing to increased oxygen consumption? So this is where one thing, for example, seizures can actually markedly decrease your SpO2. So if you have a kid that's having seizures, particularly if they're